For 18 years the Bible goes completely silent about Jesus. He stuns every scholar in the temple at 12 years old, and then he simply vanishes from the record until he turns 30. No miracles, no teachings, no stories, just silence. So where was he? What was he doing? And why did the same writers who recorded every parable and every healing choose to leave this enormous gap totally blank? The answers have sparked the wildest theories in religious history. Secret trips to India, monasteries in the Himalayas, a forged manuscript that fooled the entire world. But the truth might be stranger than any of them. And the strangest part is how ordinary it probably was. To understand what really filled those years, you have to start with the dirt under his feet. You have to start with the village. Because Nazareth in the 1st century was nothing like the town you picture when you hear the name. It was small, painfully small. The best estimates from people who dig through ancient ruins for a living put the population somewhere between 200 and 400 people. A farming hamlet pressed into the hills of Lower Galilee. Miles from any real city. Miles from anything that mattered to anyone with power. There was a Roman historian named Josephus who wrote pages and pages about this region, naming towns and describing battles. And he never once bothered to mention Nazareth. It was beneath notice. And one of the men who would later follow Jesus, when he first heard the name of the place, basically asked whether anything good could ever crawl out of a town like that. That was the reputation. A nowhere full of nobodies. The houses were tiny, built from the local limestone, stacked and fitted by hand, topped with flat roofs that families slept on when the summer heat made the rooms unbearable. The windows, if a house even had them, were little more than slits in the wall. The light inside was dim. Families shared open courtyards where the cooking happened, where the animals were kept at night, where children ran underfoot, and the whole village functioned like one enormous tangled family. Everybody knew everybody, every birth, every death, every argument, every secret. Nothing stayed hidden for long in a place that size. This is the world that shaped him. Not a palace, not a temple. A cluster of stone houses where the same faces appeared at the same well every single morning. But here is the thing most people miss when they imagine those silent years. Life in Nazareth had a rhythm, a heartbeat, and that rhythm tells us far more about who Jesus was becoming than any story about him sneaking off to a foreign land. Every single week, the entire village stopped, from Friday evening to Saturday evening. All work ceased completely. The Sabbath, families gathered. The community walked to the synagogue together for prayers, for the reading of scripture, for argument and discussion about what those ancient words meant. Luke later tells us plainly that going to synagogue on the Sabbath was Jesus' custom. Read that word again, custom. It was a habit worn smooth by repetition. He did not suddenly start showing up when his ministry began. He had been walking through that doorway every week for as long as his legs could carry him there. And the synagogue was not just a place to pray. In a village like Nazareth, it was everything at once. It was the school where boys learned their letters. It was the courthouse where disputes between neighbors got settled. It was the town hall. It was the inn where a traveling teacher might stop and share something new from the wider world. And above all, it was the place where the Torah was read aloud. Week after week, in a cycle that wrapped through the entire text across the span of a year and then began again. Do the math on that. By the time Jesus reached 30, he had heard the whole Torah read out loud more than a dozen times. The law, the prophets, the Psalms sung and chanted, the old wisdom passages turned over and over, the words sinking into him slowly, year by year, until they stopped being something he heard and became part of the very way he thought, the way he saw, the way he spoke. But the synagogue was only the weekly rhythm. There was a larger rhythm too, one that pulled the family out of the hills and onto the open road. 3 times every year, Jewish families were expected to make the journey to Jerusalem for the great festivals. Passover in the spring, the Feast of Weeks 7 weeks after that, and the Harvest Feast in the fall. Luke tells us specifically that Jesus' family made the trip to Jerusalem for Passover every single year. And that journey was no small thing. It was around 65 miles. Roughly 4 days of walking each direction. Families traveled in long caravans for safety. Dozens of people moving together. Camping beside the road at night. Singing the old pilgrim psalms as the dust rose around their feet. Now stop and think about what those trips did to a boy growing up in a village of 300 people. Jerusalem was the beating heart of the entire Jewish world. The temple stood there, the sacred center of everything. A staggering complex of courts and columns and altars that would have made anything in Nazareth look like a child building with pebbles. During the festivals, tens of thousands of pilgrims flooded through the gates. Merchants arrived from every corner of the known earth, hawking goods in a dozen languages. Roman soldiers stood watch on the walls and at the corners. And in every shaded portico, religious teachers argued fiercely about the meaning of the law. For a kid from a farming village, the sheer scale of it must have been overwhelming. The noise, the smell of incense and blood and bread, the crush of bodies. And he went, again and again, through all the years of his childhood and youth. Each visit would have peeled back another layer. Each trip taught him a little more about the tension humming under the surface of his world. The tension between the Jewish faith and the Roman boot pressing down on it. The tension between the wealthy priestly families who controlled the temple and the ordinary worshippers who simply wanted to come and pray to God without being squeezed for every coin. By the time Jesus stepped out into public view at 30, he already knew Jerusalem in his bones. He knew its streets, its temple courts, its politics, and yes, its corruption. None of it surprised him when his ministry began. He had been quietly watching it all unfold for the better part of 20 years. But that is only half the picture. Because between the Sabbaths and the pilgrimages, during the long ordinary weeks, Jesus was doing something with his hands. And what he was doing has been quietly mistranslated for almost 2,000 years. Every English Bible you have ever opened calls Jesus a carpenter. You have heard it your whole life. The gentle carpenter. But the original Greek word the Gospel writers used was not a word for someone who builds chairs and tables. The word was tekton. And tekton does not mean woodworker. It means a builder, a craftsman, someone who works with whatever the land provides. And in Nazareth, where trees were scarce and scrubby, but limestone lay everywhere you looked, that almost certainly meant stone. The men who actually dig through the ruins of Galilee have confirmed it. The houses from that period were built mostly of stone. Somewhere around 80% of the building material in first-century Galilee was stone, with wood used mainly for roof beams and door frames. So when the Bible calls Jesus a tekton, the honest picture is not a man sanding a plank. It is a man cutting and shaping blocks of limestone, raising walls, setting foundations, maybe building an olive press or a storage room dug into the hillside. A general builder who could handle whatever a poor farming village needed built. Not exactly the soft figure in the paintings. And here is where it gets genuinely interesting. Just 4 miles from Nazareth, about an hour of walking downhill, sat one of the largest cities in all of Galilee, a place called Sepphoris. And Sepphoris was everything Nazareth was not. It was the capital of the whole region under Herod Antipas, the son of the famous Herod. Josephus, that same historian who could not be bothered to name Nazareth, called Sepphoris the ornament of all Galilee. And right around the years when Jesus was growing into a young man, Sepphoris was a city being rebuilt from the ground up. Years earlier there had been a Jewish revolt, and the Romans had crushed the city in response, burning and leveling much of it. Then Herod Antipas decided to raise it again as his shining capital. Grander than before. Now hold those two facts side by side. The single biggest building boom in the entire region, and a village full of stoneworkers and builders sitting 1 hour up the hill. More than a few scholars have concluded that Joseph and Jesus almost certainly worked on those projects in Sepphoris. The logic is hard to argue with. There was simply too much work, paying too well, too close to home, for skilled builders to ignore it. And the city they were helping to build was no rough frontier town. It had paved colonnaded streets, markets, a Roman-style theater carved into the hillside that could seat 4,000 people, public buildings, ritual baths, wealthy homes with mosaic floors so finely made that the people who study them today gave one of them a nickname. They call her the Mona Lisa of the Galilee. So picture it, a young man, maybe 13, maybe 14, walking down the hill to Sepphoris beside his father in the gray light of early morning. Working all day alongside other craftsmen drawn in from the surrounding villages. Cutting stone, hauling baskets of rubble, haggling with suppliers over the price of timber and lime. brushing shoulders with Roman officials and with Greek-speaking Jews who dressed differently, ate differently, and lived in a way that would have scandalized the conservative families back home in Nazareth. This was his classroom in human nature. Long before he ever spoke a public word, he was watching how power worked, how money changed hands, how the rich treated the men who built their houses. And here is a detail that will quietly change the way you read the Gospels forever. That word hypocrite, the word Jesus would later hurl again and again at the religious leaders. It comes from the Greek word for a stage actor, a person who performs behind a mask. And Sepphoris had a theater full of actors performing behind masks. It is entirely possible that young Jesus stood in that crowd and watched them work. Watched a man pretend to be someone he was not for the entertainment of the audience. And filed it away, his famous line about a city set on a hill that cannot be hidden. Sepphoris sat on a hilltop, visible for miles in every direction. He would have seen it glowing in the evening sun nearly every day of his childhood. And yet here is the strange part. Jesus never once mentioned Sepphoris by name in any gospel. Not a single time. There is no record of him ever setting foot in it during his ministry. The great city an hour from his door, the city he very likely helped to build, simply does not appear in his story. Why? Some who study this believe he avoided it on purpose. Because of what it stood for. The cozy partnership between the Jewish ruling class and Roman power. The wealth built on the cracked hands and bent backs of peasant laborers. The very system he would one day stand up and challenge. The boy may have built its walls. The man wanted nothing to do with it. And once you understand what his hands actually did all day, something opens up in his teaching that you can never close again. Go back through every parable he ever told, every image, every metaphor, every comparison. You will find farmers scattering seed across their fields. You will find shepherds searching the hills for one lost sheep. You will find fishermen dragging nets heavy with the morning catch. And you will find builders, foundations, cornerstones, stone laid upon stone upon stone. But here is what you will not find. You will not find carpentry. Almost nothing about wood at all. No story about planing a board smooth. No image of cutting a joint or fitting a frame together. The closest he ever comes is a passing remark about a speck and a plank in someone's eye. And even that is more about hypocrisy than woodworking. Think about how strange that is. If a man spends 20 years doing the same work every single day, that work seeps into his speech. It becomes the well he draws his images from. And Jesus' images came up dripping with stone, not sawdust. On this rock I will build my church. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The wise man who built his house upon the rock. When he stood looking up at the towering temple in Jerusalem, he told his friends that not one stone there would be left sitting on another. Rocks, foundations, cornerstones, buildings thrown down. That is the language of a man who spent his working life with his palms pressed against limestone. Not the language of a man who shaped soft pine. And it runs deeper than a handful of famous lines. When Jesus chose a new name for the leader of his followers, he did not call him the branch or the beam. He called him Peter. From the Greek word for rock, he looked at a fisherman and saw a foundation stone. When he wanted to describe the religious leaders who had rejected him, he reached for an old psalm and spoke of the stone the builders threw aside that ended up becoming the cornerstone. And you have to understand what a cornerstone actually is to feel the weight of that. A cornerstone is the very first stone set into a foundation. Every other stone in the entire structure gets aligned to it. If that first stone sits even slightly wrong, the whole building rises crooked, and there is no fixing it without tearing the thing down. Jesus chose that image because he had laid cornerstones with his own hands. He knew exactly what happened when you got the first one wrong. Even his words about destruction came out in a builder's voice. When his followers stood gawking at the colossal stones of the temple, some of them weighing hundreds of tons, blocks so massive you cannot imagine the labor that set them in place. Jesus told them that not one of those stones would be left resting on another. Every one of them would be thrown down. He was not speaking as a dreamy poet reaching for a dramatic image. He was speaking as a man who knew precisely how a stone structure was assembled. Stone by patient stone, and therefore knew exactly what it would take to pull the whole thing apart. And then there is the parable that ties it all together. The one about the two builders. The people who study the actual soil around Nazareth have found something that makes that little story far sharper than it sounds in church. The ground there is sandy, and during the long dry summer it bakes hard as pavement, hard enough to fool a lazy man into thinking it makes a fine foundation. But when the spring rains come pouring down, that same hard ground turns soft and treacherous beneath the surface. The builders of that region knew they had to dig down through the deceptive sandy crust, sometimes 10 feet deep, until they struck the solid bedrock underneath. Only then could they build something that would last. So when Jesus told the story of the wise man who built on rock and the fool who built on sand, he was not spinning a pretty metaphor out of thin air. He was describing his actual job. He had seen it with his own eyes. Season after season, he knew that the careless builder who skipped the brutal labor of digging down to bedrock would lose everything the day the floods arrived. And he knew that the builder who did the work no one would ever see, the foundation buried deep in the earth where no admirer would ever praise it, was the one whose house would still be standing when the storm passed. That is not the teaching of a philosopher in a tower spinning theories. That is the teaching of a man who dug foundations for a living and watched fools cut corners and pay for it. But something happened in that household during those silent years. Something the Bible never states outright but cannot quite hide. At some point, Joseph died. Scripture never records his death. There is no scene, no deathbed, no funeral. He is simply there in the story when Jesus is 12, standing in the temple, and then he is gone, vanished from the narrative. Joseph is never once mentioned during the entire ministry of Jesus. Not at a wedding, not at a meal, not at the cross. And there is a clue buried in how the neighbors spoke. When the people of Nazareth later talked about Jesus, they called him the son of Mary. And in that culture, that phrasing was unusual, almost pointed. A man was always named through his father. You were the son of so and so, unless your father was dead and long gone. If Joseph did die while Jesus was still a young man, the weight that fell on those shoulders is almost too heavy to imagine. As the eldest son, Jesus would have become the head of the household, the provider, the one responsible for keeping everyone alive. And according to Mark, this was not a small family. The Gospel names his brothers, James and Joses and Judas and Simon, and mentions at least 2 sisters on top of that. That is a minimum of 7 children. So picture a boy of 15 or 16 suddenly carrying the survival of a family of 8 or 9 human beings. In a village where the work was unsteady and the money was always thin. There would have been no time to wander off to distant lands. No leisure to sit at the feet of foreign mystics. Every single day would have been a fight to find enough work to put bread on the table that night. This is the picture most serious historians believe is the truth behind the silence. Not adventure, not secret initiations, just a young man working himself raw with his hands to keep his mother and his brothers and his sisters from going hungry. In one of the poorest forgotten corners of the entire Roman Empire. And honestly, that ought to be enough. It is a profound and human story all on its own. But that answer has never satisfied everyone. And there is a reason it has not. Here is the question that gnaws at people. How does a stoneworker from a village of 300 suddenly stand up at 30 years old with wisdom, authority, and a command of language so sharp that it left trained scholars with their mouths hanging open? Where does that come from? And that single question has birthed some of the wildest theories in the entire history of religion. The first one involves a forged manuscript, a Russian adventurer, and a Buddhist monastery clinging to the side of the Himalayas. In the year 1894, a man named Nicholas Notovich published a book that sent a shockwave rolling through the Christian world. He claimed that while traveling through India, he had broken his leg and was carried up to a remote monastery in Ladakh, high in the mountains. And there, he said, the monks brought out an ancient manuscript, the life of Saint Isa, Isa being the name used for Jesus in parts of the East. According to Notovich, this hidden text told the story of a young Israelite who left his homeland at the age of 13 and traveled east. It claimed he spent years in India studying the sacred Hindu texts with the priests, then moved on to Nepal to absorb the teachings of the Buddha, before finally circling back home through Persia on his way to Israel. The book exploded. It ran through printing after printing in its first year alone. And you can understand why people could not put it down. The idea that Jesus had walked the roads of India, had sat humbly at the feet of Eastern masters, had soaked up the wisdom of the East before coming home to launch his ministry. It was irresistible. It filled the silence with something exotic and grand. But the scholars tore it to pieces almost immediately. One of the leading experts on Eastern religion at the time rode directly to the head of that monastery in the mountains to check the story. The reply came back flat and final. No Western visitor had stayed there in the past 15 years. No such manuscript existed. Then a British professor actually made the long journey to the monastery himself in 1895 and questioned the head lama in person. Again, the lama denied all of it. No injured Russian, no ancient text, nothing. And then came the detail that should have ended the whole affair. When Notovich was confronted with these flat denials, his story quietly changed. In the next edition of his book, he no longer claimed to have been shown a single bound manuscript. Now he said he had pieced the text together himself from scattered fragments spread across many different scrolls. That is not a small adjustment. That is a man whose story is coming apart in his hands. But the legend refused to die, because people wanted it to be true. Decades later, in 1922, an Indian holy man claimed he too had visited that same monastery and been shown that same manuscript. He even published around 40 verses from it. But his account contradicted Notovich on basic facts. Notovich had said the text was written in one language. The holy man said it was written in another. And after this man died, one of his own followers traveled back to the monastery to find the manuscript and was told, conveniently, that it had simply disappeared. A few years after that, a painter traveling through the same region recorded local legends about a prophet named Isa. But his account lined up suspiciously well with sections of Notovich's book, which by then had been circulating widely for decades. The legends he heard were almost certainly born from the book, not the other way around. Other travelers made similar claims over the years. Nearly all of them pointed to the same monastery. Nearly all of them came after the book became famous. And to this day, not one person has ever produced the actual manuscript for anyone to examine. And yet, here is what honesty demands. Even though that manuscript is almost certainly a forgery, the question it stirred up is not a foolish one. Because 1st century Palestine was not some sealed-off backwater cut off from the world. It sat at the crossroads of 3 continents. One of the great trade routes of the ancient world ran straight through Galilee. Merchants moved along it carrying goods from India, from Persia, from Arabia, from Egypt and Rome. Capernaum, the very town where Jesus would later base his ministry, sat right on that road. And ideas travel the same roads as silk and spices. Buddhist missionaries had been active in the Mediterranean world for centuries already. Ever since an Indian emperor sent envoys west generations before Jesus was born. So while there is no evidence that Jesus himself ever traveled to India, it is entirely possible that faint echoes of Eastern thought reached his ears through the ordinary mixing of cultures happening all around him in the marketplace. Some people point to the similarities between certain sayings of Jesus and Buddhist principles. Compassion, not clinging to wealth, loving even your enemies, and those parallels are real. But the simplest explanation is not borrowing. It is that deep moral truth tends to surface wherever human beings sit down and wrestle honestly with the biggest questions of existence. Compassion belongs to no single tradition. Generosity is not anyone's private property. They rise up naturally, in different places, among different people, because they are true. But India was not the only theory. There was another group, far closer to home, and this one comes with actual evidence buried in the desert. They were called the Essenes, a Jewish sect that flourished during the centuries around the time of Jesus. The ancient writers tell us they numbered around 4,000, scattered in communities throughout the land, but their most famous settlement sat at a place called Qumran, on the dry northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. And Qumran is where, in 1947, a shepherd boy stumbled onto clay jars hidden in a cave, jars holding the scrolls that would become one of the greatest discoveries in the history of religion. And when those scrolls were finally translated, people began to notice something that unsettled them. The parallels between the beliefs of this sect and early Christianity were striking. Communal living, where members shared their property, sacred shared meals, ritual washing with water, A burning expectation that the end of the age was near. The idea of a new covenant between God and his people. Does any of that sound familiar? And the connection grows even more intriguing when you turn your eyes to John the Baptist. John lived out in the Judean wilderness, not far from Qumran at all. He practiced baptism as a ritual of turning away from sin. He wore rough clothing and lived a hard, stripped-down life in the desert. He preached that God's judgment was rushing toward them. Every piece of that mirrors the way the Essenes lived. And Luke tells us something curious about John, that he was born to elderly parents and lived in the wilderness until the day he appeared publicly to Israel. Some have wondered whether his aging parents, unable to raise him in their final years, may have handed him over to the Essene community, which was known to take in and raise children. So could Jesus have brushed up against the Essenes during his silent years? If only through his cousin John. It is possible, but here is the fascinating turn. The evidence suggests that if he did know their way, he looked at it carefully and then deliberately walked the opposite direction. The Essenes were obsessed with purity. They built their entire lives around staying separate from anyone they judged unclean. Rigid rules about who could eat with whom, punishing rules about the Sabbath, rules governing every tiny detail of the day. And Jesus did the exact opposite. He ate with tax collectors and with people the religious world had thrown away. He reached out and touched lepers, the very people the pure were terrified to go near. He healed on the Sabbath and dared anyone to object. He welcomed outsiders. The Essenes cared intensely about which priestly family held control of the temple. Jesus never raised the question once. The Essenes followed their own separate calendar and argued bitterly about it. Jesus shows no interest in calendar disputes at all. If anything, when you lay it all side by side, Jesus looks like a man who understood the Essene path completely and then chose, on purpose, to do the opposite. He did not retreat into a pure isolated community in the desert. He walked straight into the messy, crowded world and sat down at the table with the people everyone else avoided. But long before any of these modern theories existed, ancient people were already desperate to fill the silence. And the stories they invented are wild. There is an old text, probably written in the 2nd century, that tells tales of Jesus as a child with terrifying supernatural powers and frankly a short temper. In one story, a boy bumps into him in the street, and the child Jesus curses him, and the boy falls down dead. In another, a teacher tries to instruct the young Jesus, and Jesus humiliates him, proving he already knows more than the teacher ever could. There is even a scene where the boy molds little sparrows out of wet clay on the Sabbath, and when someone scolds him for working on the holy day, he simply claps his hands, and the clay birds burst into life and fly away. No serious branch of Christianity has ever accepted these stories as real. The early church leaders specifically threw them out, precisely because the petty, vengeful child in them looks nothing like the Jesus of the trusted Gospels. But the fact that these stories were written at all tells us something important. As early as the 2nd century, ordinary Christians were already hungry, already aching to know what happened in those missing years. The silence bothered them then exactly as much as it bothers us now. And the theories never stopped coming. There are medieval legends from Britain claiming a tin merchant carried the young Jesus on trading voyages to the coast of England. A famous English poet was so moved by that legend that he wrote a hymn wondering whether those holy feet had walked upon England's green mountains. Other traditions placed Jesus in the Americas. Still others sent him to Rome, or to Kashmir, or even to a village in Japan where a grave is said to mark where he died as an old man. Nearly every great religion, and dozens of small ones, have tried to claim a piece of those silent years, and the sheer number of competing stories is itself proof of how deep this mystery runs in the human heart. But none of them hold up, so we are left with the real question. How does a builder from a nowhere village become the teacher who split history in two? And the answer that finally makes sense might be the single most overlooked piece of the entire puzzle. Because Jewish education in the 1st century was no casual thing. It was rigorous, demanding, and it started young. Beginning around the age of 5 or 6, boys went to the synagogue school. There they learned to read Hebrew and they began to memorize the Torah. Not skim it, memorize it. Many boys committed the entire Torah to memory, word for word, all 5 books, held in the mind like a song you can never forget. Then around the age of 10, the best students moved up to a more advanced level, where they learned to interpret the scriptures, to argue over their meaning, to handle the layers of oral tradition that had grown up around the text. At 13, a boy became a man in the eyes of the community, and at that point, most boys left the books behind to learn their father's trade. But the gifted few, the ones who had shown a rare fire for scripture and debate, could seek out a teacher to follow. They would attach themselves to a rabbi, walk where he walked, learn how he thought, and dream of one day becoming teachers themselves. Now go back to that scene in the temple, the only window the Gospels give us into his youth. Jesus is 12 years old, and he is not asking simple childish questions. He is holding his own in debate with the most learned religious minds in the entire nation. The scholars are amazed. That single scene tells us something crucial. By 12, Jesus had already received an extraordinary education. He was not a beginner. He was already exceptional. And Luke tells us that after that, returning home to Nazareth, he kept growing in wisdom. The word Luke shows there means to advance, to push forward, to keep driving ahead. It is not the word for a plant passively soaking up sun. It is the word for active, deliberate, relentless learning. And later, when Jesus stood up in that same Nazareth synagogue as a grown man, Luke shows us a person completely at home in the scriptures. He took the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and he did not fumble for the passage. He found the exact words he wanted, read them aloud with total fluency, rolled the scroll back up, sat down, and delivered a teaching that left the whole room speechless. That kind of command does not appear out of nowhere. It is not a gift that drops from the sky on your 30th birthday. It is the fruit of years. Years of reading, years of memorizing, years of turning the words over in the quiet of an ordinary life when no one was watching and no one was impressed. And his parables prove it. Those brilliant layered little stories about farmers and seeds and hidden treasure and lost sheep are soaked through with intimate knowledge. Knowledge of the scriptures, knowledge of the rhythms of farming life, knowledge of the human heart and how it really works. The seed that fell on rocky ground and withered. He had watched farmers fight that exact battle every spring. The laborers in the vineyard arguing over their wages. He knew that argument in his gut, because he had stood in line for his pay at Sepphoris. The house built on rock instead of sand. He had built those houses with his own hands and knew which ones would stand and which ones would wash away. His silent years were not empty. They were full to bursting. Full of backbreaking labor and family duty and quiet study and the patient deep watching of the world around him. He was gathering everything, storing it all away, for the day he would finally step out of the shadows. And here is the detail that confirms it more than anything else. The Gospels make it brutally clear that when Jesus finally did step forward, the people who knew him best were stunned, not impressed, stunned. When he came home and taught in the Nazareth synagogue, his own neighbors reacted with something close to offense. Wait, is this not the builder? Do we not know his mother? Are his brothers and sisters not living right here among us? Where on earth did all this come from? They could not square the man standing before them with the quiet laborer they had watched for 30 years. He had been too ordinary, too known, too much one of them. And it was not only the neighbors. It was his own family. John states it without flinching. Even his own brothers did not believe in him. His own brothers, the men who had grown up in the same cramped house, eaten at the same table, worked beside him hauling stone. And it gets worse. Mark describes a moment early in the ministry when Jesus' family came to physically take him away, to seize him and bring him home by force, because they thought he had lost his mind. His own flesh and blood looked at what he was doing and concluded he had gone mad. Sit with what that means for those silent years. For nearly 2 decades Jesus lived under the same roof as these brothers. James and Joseph and Judas and Simon. He ate with them. He worked with them. After their father died, he very likely helped raise them. He was their older brother, their provider, their protector. And when he finally revealed who he truly was, when he finally stepped into the calling he had been preparing for all those silent years, they did not throw their arms around him. They tried to drag him home and lock the door. That tells us something quietly devastating about those 18 years. Jesus was not living in some warm nest where everyone sensed his greatness and cheered him on toward his destiny. He was living among people who saw nothing special in him at all. People who would one day be embarrassed by him. Whatever was growing inside him during those years, whatever understanding he was building through study and prayer and watching, he was building it alone. Nobody in that house understood. Nobody in that village saw it coming. He carried everything he was becoming in total silence, year after year, with no one to share it. And here is the twist that makes it almost unbearable in the best way. James, the brother who did not believe, the brother who thought he was out of his mind, that same James would one day become the leader of the entire Christian church in Jerusalem. Something changed his mind. Paul tells us that after the resurrection, Jesus appeared to James alone, just the two of them. We are not told a word about what passed between them, but whatever happened in that meeting turned a skeptic into the head of a movement. The annoyed younger brother became the pillar of the church, but during the silent years, none of that was visible. James just saw his strange older brother, nothing more. Which means whatever was really happening in those years could not be seen from the outside. Jesus was not wandering Nazareth performing miracles. He was not giving public lectures in the square. He went to work in the morning. He came home at night. He went to synagogue on the Sabbath. To every single person around him, he looked like nothing more than another builder trying to make a living in a hard world. And maybe that is the most radical thing about the silent years. Not that they are silent, but that they were ordinary. The man whose birth literally split the calendar of the world into before and after spent roughly 90% of his life doing nothing that anyone of his time would have called remarkable. He worked, he ate, he slept under the same stars that, if you believe the deeper claim of the story, he himself had set in place. He waited. There is one more angle worth standing in, and it has to do with why the Gospels stay silent at all. The men who wrote them were not writing biographies the way we think of them. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John each had a purpose burning in them. They were writing to convince real people, in real cities, that Jesus was the promised one, the Messiah who fulfilled the ancient prophecies. For that purpose, what mattered was his public ministry, his teaching, his death, his resurrection. The silent years simply were not the point they were trying to make. So they left them out, not because the years were empty, but because they were not the argument. But some have offered a deeper possibility. What if the silence itself is part of the message? In the Jewish tradition, the number 30 carries weight. The Levites began their sacred service at 30. David was 30 when he became king. The prophet Ezekiel received his first great vision at 30. 30 was the age of readiness. The age when a man was finally considered seasoned enough for serious spiritual weight to be laid on him. By staying quiet until 30, the gospel writers may have been saying something without saying it. Jesus waited until the proper time. He did not rush. He did not grasp at attention before he was ready for it. And for the early Christians reading these accounts, the message would have landed hard, if even he waited, hidden and unknown for decades before stepping into his calling. Then your own long season of waiting is not wasted. It is not failure. It is preparation. And then, when the moment finally arrived, everything changed in an instant. All four Gospels tell it. He came to the river to be baptized. And as he rose from the water, the heavens tore open. The Spirit came down on him like a dove. And a voice spoke from heaven and said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." That was the trigger. Not a diploma from some secret school in India. Not a final test passed in a desert community. A voice from heaven, breaking through 18 years of silence, saying now. For 18 years Jesus had lived in a world where no one saw anything special in him. His neighbors thought he was just a builder. His own family sometimes thought he had lost his mind. He had been dismissed before he ever began. And he kept going anyway. He kept studying. He kept working. He kept preparing for something not one other person could see. And when the moment came, he was ready, not because he had crossed the world and unlocked some hidden secret, but because he had done the hardest thing a human being can do. He had been faithful in the small things, in the invisible things, in the dull grinding ordinary work of daily life, for years, with no recognition and no reward. And there is one final thing hiding in plain sight that seals it. When Jesus began to teach, the religious authorities kept circling back to one quality that baffled them. His authority. He did not teach the way other rabbis taught. The normal way was to quote the teachers who came before you. Rabbi so-and-so says this. Rabbi so-and-so says that. You built your authority by leaning on the chain of teachers behind you. But Jesus said, I say to you. He spoke as though he had the right to interpret the scriptures on his own, without anyone's permission. And that kind of quiet, unshakable confidence does not come from a single dramatic moment by a river. It comes from years of wrestling with the text, years of working out what you believe and exactly why you believe it, long before anyone is listening. And his understanding reached far beyond scripture. He understood money lending. He understood the brutal economics of farming. He understood the legal system, the power games between Rome and the Jewish authorities, the slow workings of corruption, the raw psychology of grief. He understood people, on every level, in a way that cannot be taught from books alone. And that breadth comes from one thing: paying attention. For a very long time. For 18 years Jesus paid attention. To the men he worked beside. To the merchants he bargained with. To the leaders arguing in the synagogue. To the Roman soldiers on the road. To the beggars and the widows that everyone else stepped around without a second glance. By the time he opened his mouth to teach, he did not need to study human nature. He had lived it. He had been poor. He had been a worker. He had been part of a family clawing to survive. He had buried his father. He had been written off as a nobody from a town that produced nothing. And maybe that is exactly why the Gospels say so little about those years. Not because nothing happened, but because what happened was so thoroughly, so completely human, so utterly ordinary, that it would have seemed almost boring to men trying to convince the world that this was the Son of God. But 2,000 years later, those silent years might be the most relatable part of the whole story. Because every person who has ever felt invisible, every person who has ever worked hard and gone unseen, every person who has ever lain awake wondering if their quiet season of preparation will ever amount to anything at all, they can look at those 18 years and see their own reflection staring back. Think of those years like the foundation of a great building. The part no one ever praises. The part buried so deep in the earth that no visitor will ever lay eyes on it. People stand and admire the soaring walls and the carved cornerstones above the ground. No one throws their arms wide at the foundation. No one writes songs about the rock hidden 10 feet down in the dark. And yet that buried unseen stone is the only reason the whole structure stands when the floods come. The silent years were the foundation, dug in darkness, praised by no one, and strong enough to hold up everything that came after. The mystery has captivated people for 20 centuries. Adventurers forged manuscripts, monks told tales, scholars argued, whole libraries were written trying to fill the gap. But the answer may be the simplest one of all. During those 18 years, in the most ordinary and human way imaginable, Jesus was becoming who he needed to be. He grew up. He worked until his hands cracked. He studied in the quiet. He loved a family that did not understand him. He watched the world with the kind of attention only someone gives who somehow knows he will need every single lesson later. And then, when the time was finally right, he walked out of that little nowhere village and straight into history. Those 18 years were never lost. They were the foundation the whole world would one day be built upon.